In 1991, it was discovered that the heart had its own nervous systems, over 40,000 neurons that actually had a greater power than our brain. So today I want to introduce you to a wonderful woman called Helen Millar.
I didn't live a life full of love. I didn't live a life full of meaning. I was desperately unhappy, desperately miserable, and didn't feel loved. I was desperately searching for love in all the wrong places. I was car crashing through life. When I reached rock bottom and then had a massive spiritual awakening a few years after that, I then realized that there was a completely different way to be. I hated myself, really hated myself. There were multiple suicide attempts, and I couldn't understand how other people experienced life. Then went at Glastonbury Festival, we're gallivanting around, and somebody gave me a bag of mushrooms. I was like, okay, and then I lost everybody. And so I thought, well, I'll have these mushrooms, and I didn't know how many to take. I thought, what are mushrooms going to do? You know, they're a vegetable, fungi, whatever. So I ate the whole bag.
Oh my gosh.
And then 20 minutes later, I was like, nothing's happened. And somebody had seen me eat this bag of mushrooms like it was popcorn. And then they were like, do you know how many mushrooms you just ate? And I was like, no, but they haven't done anything. And they went, do you want some more? So somebody gave me another bag and was like, look at this girl, she's eating all the mushrooms. 3 days later, I had had my spiritual awakening that lasted for 3 days. That process left me for a couple of years at least, a bit like Star Trek, when they go in that tunnel, beam me up, Scotty, and then you pixelate, and then you land somewhere else in the ship. I pixelated, but I didn't land anywhere for several years.
Tell us a little bit about your work with the heart, because that is your forte.
So my work around the heart started in the same way I dismissed mushrooms and thought, what are they going to do? I dismissed cacao.
Welcome to The Wellness Way with me, Philly J. Lay, a layperson's guide to your natural health systems, your very own NHS.
Hello, lovely people, and welcome to another episode of The Wellness Way. In 1991, it was discovered that the heart had its own nervous systems, over 40,000 neurons that actually had a greater power than our brain. And when you coordinate the two, you have something called heart-brain coherence. And this is something that I've always found incredibly fascinating. So today I want to introduce you to a wonderful woman called Helen Millar from the Head to Heart Academy. Helen, welcome to the show. I love the work that you're putting out there. So let's talk a little bit about you and how you started this extraordinary journey into the heart.
Thanks, Philly. Pleasure to be here, and also a big fan of your work.
Thank you.
So I think we end up teaching what we need. We end up teaching what we know and we've lived. And I didn't live a life full of love. I didn't live a life full of meaning. I was desperately unhappy, desperately miserable, and didn't feel loved. I was desperately searching for love in all the wrong places. And as more and more in that kind of vibration, in that mindset, because of things that had happened to me as I grew up, I was car crashing through life. There was one traumatic event and then another, and eventually, when I reached rock bottom and then had a massive spiritual awakening a few years after that, I then realized that there was a completely different way to be, and then I dived headfirst. I was so thirsty. It was like I'd been starving for 30 years, and then I was trying to suck the marrow of the healing out of the cosmos. And that journey has been a process of me shifting from my head, from the trauma, from the fear, from the anger into my heart, into love, abundance, surrender, forgiveness, plenty and freedom and creativity.
No, you've had a massive journey, and I know that you were, as a teenager, anorexic, hospitalized with anorexia. Can you just give us a little bit more background about what happened in your childhood that made this section of your life so traumatic?
So it depends what time of my life you ask me this question, the answer you would have got, because my mind, to protect me, had blocked out most of what had happened to me. And it was only well into my healing journey, like 6 years or so, that I started to have realizations, memories, understanding. And that has been, and still is, a process of putting the pieces together. And so essentially, I was abused for a long period of time. It started very young, when I was growing up. And then there was emotional, and I mean, none of us have the perfect childhood, but because of certain things I was told and how loved I was and what good parents I had and various other things, I didn't believe it was anything that had happened to me. The reason I felt the way I felt that I was broken and I was wrong. And I hated myself, like really hated myself. There were multiple suicide attempts, and I couldn't understand how other people experienced life. It was also my passion and why I became an actress, to understand how other people can understand the world, because I found people fascinating and I wanted to be other people. I didn't want to be me. And so what was going on for me was I was just living in emotional turmoil 24/7, with occasional bouts of appreciation of like, oh, it's a butterfly, and then back to the angst. And then from sort of 12 onwards, I found alcohol, and then I found drugs, and then I found things that could stop me feeling the way I was feeling for a period of time. And that became a big dance in my life. And food was also entwined with that. But essentially my body was the battleground because my body had been violated. My body was the battleground. And then I didn't know how to love my body. I didn't know how to love. So I continued perpetuating, harm to my body with self-harm and various other things. So it's been a real journey to learn to accept and love and be embodied and not trying to leave the planet.
Welcome to the Wellness Way. I'd like to introduce you to our sponsor, Vivo Barefoot. Embrace your human nature and reconnect to the natural world. If you'd like to know more about this, please go and check out my podcast episode with 7th generation cobbler, Galahad Clark, CEO of Vivo Barefoot. Thank you, Vivo Barefoot. Enjoy the rest of the show.
I think a lot of people don't feel loved for whatever reason. And, I consider myself to have had a pretty idyllic childhood. And yet I still had that self-loathing. I still, I trained as a classical dancer, as I've said many times. And so, in the art of which you are never enough. And so I also battled on many occasions against, a borderline anorexia, bulimia, to slightly obese because I binge, and just having this complete self-loathing. I still have it, actually. I'm not going to deny that I still have this self-loathing of my body. And although I think my body looks okay for my age, I look at it and I go, oh, now the skin's horrible, or I've got these scars, or I've got these rolls, when I sit down, there's this roll of fat, or my bum's saggy, or my tits have dropped. And, so I think everybody has this. I don't know anybody, do you, that actually looks in the mirror and goes, oh, that's a perfect body. It's just, do you know anyone that does that?
I think there are people who love their bodies, and I think there probably are people who've done that. But I think there is probably a huge amount of effort that goes into the superficial. But in general, no. And I think the Instagram culture and like that wasn't around when I was like that. But it's still like it was when the kind of heroin chic look was in models, and when I was at some of my thinnest weights, I was modeling. And my mum didn't know what to do with me because I'd been in and out of clinics. And I was like, this is a way that other people are looking at my body and liking it. So maybe this will help me. So then she sort of scarily allowed me to be in the modeling world, which didn't actually make anything worse. I was already screwed up. So, but yeah, the fact that even when I was 3 stone lighter than a healthy weight, my body was being used to tell people what clothes look good on. It's ridiculous.
It's incredibly sad. And I remember the heroin sheet looked very well. And it is alarming, the damage that did to a whole generation of young women, who thought that was acceptable. But the thing is that, we do live in this very fake Instagram world. And, we're looking at people the whole time, and people judge people. And we have to get out of that system individually. How did you start your journey to healing? Can you just tell us what happened? What was the trigger point when you woke up one day and went, oh, fuck this, I want to be happy and healthy? And how did you start that journey, Helen?
Well, I was on a gig. I was doing an acting job, and there was only two of us in the cast. And I was in digs in Bristol, and I went on Tinder because I thought, I don't know anyone here. Like maybe I could have some dates and at least have some interaction. Anyway, didn't have any dates. The job was very intense. And then after being back in London, I matched with somebody who lived there or near there, and they turned out to be drinking plant medicine and they were a Buddhist. And I was an angry atheist who had my class A's down. I'd actually stopped taking drugs by that point, but like I was like, I know how to party, but I had heard about plant medicine, and this was before it was in the mainstream as much as it is now. And the only time I'd heard about it 6 months previously, I just felt like, oh, I really want to do that. I wasn't scared. I just really wanted to. I met him.
God knows you've taken enough of other stuff. So I mean,
right.
I presume that just takes out the scary.
Well, I don't know. I didn't do any sort of research about it, but she was saying about talking about visions, and I've never done any psychedelics actually because I was brought up on my dad's horror stories of taking acid in the 60s and really screwing him up. So everything else. And so I ended up going on some dates with this guy, and he invited me to Glastonbury Festival, and I'd always wanted to go to Glastonbury Festival. None of my mates, they were party heads, they didn't want to get in a field, they wanted to be in a pub. So he said, you should come. And I said, it's in 3 weeks. It sold out in 7 seconds 9 months ago. How am I meant to come? And he was like, well, I chant, like you should chant for a ticket. And I said, well, I don't chant, you get me a ticket if this magic chanting works. And after a couple of weeks, I said, see, it doesn't work. And he said, well, it's much more powerful if you do it. So I started chanting for 5 minutes a day in the shower because I thought, well, if it doesn't work, I'm right, which is brilliant. And if it does work, I'm going to Glastonbury, which is also quite brilliant. So I started chanting. I got a ticket in 48 hours. That started my Buddhist journey. And then when at Glastonbury Festival, we're gallivanting around and somebody gave me a bag of mushrooms. And I was like, okay. And then I lost everybody. And so I thought, well, I have these mushrooms, and I didn't know how many to take. I thought, what are mushrooms going to do? They're a vegetable, fungi, whatever. So I ate the whole bag.
Oh my gosh.
And then 20 minutes later, I was like, nothing's happened. And somebody had seen me eat this bag of mushrooms like it was popcorn. And then they were like, do you know how many mushrooms you just ate? And I was like, no, but they haven't done anything. And they went, do you want some more? So somebody gave me another bag and was like, look at this girl, she's eating all the mushrooms. 3 days later, I had had my spiritual awakening that lasted for 3 days. And I had stopped eating meat overnight. I didn't know I had, but I went to the supermarket in Waterloo when I got home, and I put in my chicken salad and went, oh, and then I put it back on the shelf, and it was like putting wood in. My brain had rewired that meat was no longer food. Stayed like that. And then I was a completely different person. And for about 2 years, because I then started a very strong and intense 5-year period of working with plant medicines a lot all over the world. I'm in my integration decade now, but that process left me for a couple of years at least, a bit like Star Trek when they go in that tunnel. I was sort of a 90s kid with Jean-Luc Picard and beam me up, Scotty, and then you pixelate and then you land somewhere else in the ship. I pixelated, but I didn't land anywhere for several years. Just my ego didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I was. I didn't want to do any of the things I used to do. I didn't want to hang out in the pub. I didn't want to drink. I was kind of like, this was my career as an actor. And it was a real journey to kind of solidify again, if I ever have.
Well, do we ever solidify again? That's the whole point. Everything is energy. and nothing is real. It's all energy. It's all, it's just how dense the energy is to how we get to where we are today. So you talked earlier about that not having any self-love or self-respect, or kind of, and then this huge awakening. With that awakening, when did you start the work, and how did you start the work on learning to love yourself again? Because we're born with pure love.
Yeah. It was being in environments where people were further up the mountain than me. So I wasn't in a collective conscious environment which was about escaping, or like very much grounded in the contemporary culture and the matrix and all of those things, but being in spaces with people who were calling me sister. It really freaked me out at the beginning, and like giving me hugs, and I was like, you don't know me, like, oh, like I just
You're
finished
in my
yoga.
personal bubble. Go away.
Like I was so like this with the world, or like this with the world, and then there are people like dressed in white, kind of just wanting to chat and being shown so much kindness, and then people talking about their experiences. And I'd never really valued what I'd gone through. I dismissed it, and I hadn't really shared. I didn't know a lot of what I'd gone through at that point, but the things that had happened, no one had been able to hold them for me or hold me in them. So everything had kind of got, and then I started doing work that allowed the energy of them to unpack. And I got a great therapist who was very conscious and awake, and I still see from time to time. And
Can I just ask, was that talk therapy?
yes, but he comes from a shamanic background. But I'd had terrible talk therapy in the past prior to him. But this was in between plant medicine ceremonies, and he was helping me integrate and unpack what was happening there. And I was also chanting every day, and I was going to Buddhist meetings, and I was around, and the Buddhism helped me phenomenally because it gave me a framework and a language, and a real emphasis on being a good person, and a real emphasis on helping other people. And I wasn't raised with that. And I wasn't raised with any framework. So that structure and that discipline and that daily practice really allowed me to move very fast with doing my homework in between ceremonies. And I was chanting before the ceremony was opening in the hallway when everyone was getting changed, and I was chanting afterwards, and I was going to my meetings, and I was told not to talk about plant medicine in the Buddhist meetings, and but I was finding my way. And I then, in between that, I was doing all the courses, and I was in a sometimes what can be a trap of the new age of like seeking externally, but because I had a very strong daily practice, I was able to sort of stay grounded with that.
Okay, so this is an interesting one for me. I took my girls to the Russell Brand Community Festival last year, and they thought it was a cult. They said, "This is just a cult, Mum," and we were actually doing some breath work. So everybody was going up and down doing the breath work. And my youngest daughter filmed it, took the sound off it so you didn't know it was breath work, and just did All Hail Russell Brand as if we were worshipping, and put it out on her Instagram. So you can't believe anything you hear on social media. But I sometimes wonder this, because I'm very much like you, and I love all these ceremonies, and I'm very new to plant medicine. Only in the last year have I discovered plant medicine, and I'm just like, oh my God, I love it. I can't believe that she didn't call me earlier. Do you think it's a cult?
I have a lot of thoughts about plant medicine and how to work with it and how it's held. And I stopped counting at 50 ceremonies, and I carried on drinking for a long time after that. And I stopped in 2019, for many reasons. Partly the medicine told me to, but I still feel it within me. I think it's a brilliant tool. I think some people see the tool as a means in itself, that they don't necessarily do the work in between ceremonies and just focus on the ceremony, and it becomes, and potentially people who don't have lives where they feel very held and have great friendships, and they have a level of awakening happening, and they find their community only within the ceremony, and so it fulfills more need than just the healing, and they're going potentially for community rather than always checking in and do I need more medicine right now, because it's a big thing to drink every time you drink whatever plant medicine you're working with. And so within that environment, like any where other humans are gathered, there's a potential that things can become cliquey or bubbly, and there's always new people. And then I remember my first ceremonies thinking, oh, everyone knows so much more, and putting all these people on pedestals. And then, you know, with any pedestal, everybody has to come off them eventually. But I think it can be cult-like, and I think it's down to everybody to realize, because anything can become addictive, whether it is or not, how and when we approach something, and what is our deepest reason and integrity for doing that. Why are we doing it at that point? And also really focusing on the integration afterwards, rather than, oh, they're coming over from this country, or this is the new cool person and this thing, and you know, and then it becomes almost very mainstream.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the thing I found strangest was for the ceremonies that I've done, you know, everybody has to wear white. And for me, it was a little bit like my confirmation, where had to wear white. So it's kind of like an induction into you know, so is it a cult? Like the church, you know, you dress for your confirmation, you dress for your ceremonies, you know, can they actually be incorporated, I suppose I'm asking, into one life? And I know that you've studied a lot of religions, and so I want to talk to you a little bit about that, because it's not fashionable anymore to be a Christian. I mean, it's just not. You can't, you know, if you say I'm a Christian, people very often give you a hard time. So with your spiritual journey, and you talked about, you know, Buddhism there, can you just talk us through the different religions and how you see the plant medicine going into the spirituality?
Sure, it's a lot.
That's a big question, I'm sorry.
I actually think, but no, I love it. It's like lovely, juicy question. Thank you. Uh, I think there's a resurgence in Christianity that has happened in the last 2 years, well, last sort of 4 years, and also in Islam. Like there are more people joining now than there were prior to the lockdowns. And I think I think as the consciousness, like we're going through an expansion of consciousness on the planet, and I think as that happens, people are gravitating to systems that had maybe dismissed and seeing them in a new light, because I think the teachings themselves, if you take away the human lens that they were shared through and then received through, the teachings themselves are timeless and ever present. And so when people expand a different level of remove a different level of their own veil, they're able to get more of the truth. And whether that is Islam or Christianity or a different path or Buddhism, I feel that the most important thing is that people have faith and they have a relationship with God. And it took me a long time to get to the word God. And I'm not saying everybody should believe in God, but I believe everybody should. I don't think it's helpful for me to say everybody should do anything. I have found it personally deeply helpful to have faith, because I never had faith. So everything I had to do in my own strength. And that's why I was in a battle with life, because it felt like life was against me. And when I realized that universe, God, source can work through me and is supporting me, then everything has shifted. And in terms of the different religions and dress and culture, and I think it's about discernment. And I also think there's a huge piece about there being truth that is true for humanity for all time, as time doesn't really exist. And I also think there is a teaching coming through a human being that was also, there are specifics of that were spoken for what people needed at the time. So it's it can become problematic in the 21st century, where you look at certain teachings and try to be rigid with them today, because the teaching was for the consciousness and the people in the society at the time and not necessarily for today. Potentially it would be a different teaching now. And so I think it's about discernment and how deep your faith goes with a particular tradition. I think always it's about finding what is underneath the human level and what is in the non-natural, the supernatural.
I remember doing a series of lectures. Actually, I've been to a number of his lectures with Greg Braden, and he talks very much about an ancient biblical alphabet. I can't remember the name of it, but it's bad of me. But no, nothing's bad about me. There's this old alphabet, and it's written into our DNA, the strands of our DNA, and translated, it says God within me, that we are God, we are consciousness. And when you think about this, these are our temples. And so your mind is your force, your temple, your connection to source, spirit, God, whatever you wish to call it. And yet very often we cut that mind up because it's so full of clutter. And clutter causes chaos, whether it's in your mind, whether it's in your home. I'm a great fan of feng shui, but clutter causes chaos. How do you calm that? How do you take yourself out of your head and back into your heart?
Prayer. What was for a long period in my life chanting, but now I pray, and my own way of prayer. I also have a huge affinity with trees, and I run workshops to help people talk to trees. And when my mum died, and then my relationship ended, and my career disappeared, and we were in lockdown, I found going to ancient trees on Hampstead Heath. But that was my solace, and I was communicating with them and receiving healing. And trees really helped me. Being in water, even like doing the washing up, as soon as I touch water, like I can feel the alchemy happening. And finally, I just recently came back from India from doing a Pachakama cleanse, which is an Ayurvedic series of treatments. And I landed in Hastings, and there was 5 days with no water, no running water. And it was the hardest, like slam, like I've been in this beach in this hot sea. The sea was hotter than bathwater. It was the hottest sea I'd ever been in. I was in my absolute bliss element, and coming back to this like drought. So for me, water is a real medicine, and things that you can access very quickly. And then there's deeper things, but those are my like daily go-tos.
With water, are you concerned with the toxic chemicals in the water? Our water is so heavily polluted, and we've got other people's medicines in there. We've got, plastic, microplastics and everything. Does that worry you? Because I went through a stage in my life where I got very panicky every time I got in the bath or the shower. And then I had to kind of go and get a system to filter my water. And I think it was the Gersten theory. Do you know the Gersten theory for cancer? And I saw Gersten's daughter do a talk, and she was 92 years old, and she was still traveling over the border from America into South America once a week to lecture at 92 years old. And she was saying, when you get in the shower, if it isn't filtered, you literally go 5 days and then just kind of like get in and out really, really quickly. And I thought, okay. And it made me very panicky about the water. And I know about the water of energy. In my book, I have some of the photographs of Dr. Emoto, and I have such an understanding and love of water. Are you scared about the toxins in the water, or do you feel that because we come from water, this is kind of Sir David Attenborough, Patrick Holford, a lot of people talk about the fact that we come from water and we are made up predominantly of water, which is why you are most probably so comfortable there. Do you panic about the toxins in it?
No.
And the fluoride, and the fluoride.
No, I don't panic about it. And I try not to be in fear about anything, but I do filter my water. I have friends who have Kangen machines, and I know there's like a whole range of different ways we can filter my water. I mean, I've got a water bottle next to me with an elite Nobel Shungite in it. So that's any water that goes in there. And it is my preference to have those processes in place because of the crap, right? And I have gone through a sort of battle with the water provider where I was living for 3 years, and what low standards they had, and they were dumping sewage in the sea, and all of those things irritate me. But ultimately, our human technology and our faith, as you know, can like transmute anything. That's not to say that I think we should be reckless with what we eat and what we do with our bodies, but there's one of the healers who actually you've had on this show, John Mason, who is somebody I see who I think is an absolute star
Oh
of a
God, I
human.
love John. Superhuman.
So
If
he
you
told
haven't
me,
checked out that podcast, guys, please go and check it out because it was quite extraordinary. And actually, I worked with him for a couple of hours before we recorded, and it was just like, whoa.
so
Carry on, sorry.
I worked with John quite a lot, especially after I had a big sort of black magic attack thing, and he's been very helpful. He told me a story about one of the saint sages in India who he'd spent time with, who would go out and be living his life, and all his followers would just follow him around. And if he went into a shop and bought some flip-flops, everybody would run in, and then they'd buy the same flip-flops. They'd get cross if they'd sold out, and because they were trying to just mimic everything he did to be like him. And then he saw them doing all this, rolling his eyes. And then he went into a cafe and he asked for a glass of water, and he drank the water. And then he took the glass, and they were all peering in through the window, seeing what he was going to order for food. And he got the glass and he smashed it on the table, and then he sat there eating the glass. And then he came outside and he said, "Until you can do this, it doesn't matter what I do. You are all capable of doing this, but don't do this because your frequency isn't here yet." Right? So I think it's that for me epitomizes make sensible choices, but the energy of fear, the frequency of fear or worry or consternation, or all of, freaking out about water on aeroplanes or whatever it might be, is far more damaging to my body than helping me accelerate the frequency that I base myself at, to the extent that anything I put through my vehicle can be transmuted.
I completely agree with you. I think that's very wise words. And I remember on my healing journey when I started tapping, and and I'd done really well on my healing journey, but I was paranoid about what I ate. Is it organic? Is there GMO in there? Is there a seed oil? Is there this? Is there gluten? Really paranoid. And my coach and trainer said to me, the fear that you put yourself under every time you eat is so much more damaging than anything you could ever put in your body. And it's true, fear is the biggest suppressor of the immune system. I've got to tell a funny story here, though. She might not thank me for this, but my eldest daughter, her 18th birthday, because she is not comfortable with her body. And I gave her a book called Eat Yourself Thin. And it was a psychology book on the power of the mind. And Marissa Pearce talks about this as well. If you want that treat as a cake, you pick it up and go, I really fancy you today. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to bite into you, and you're just going to metabolize really quickly, and you're not going to put any weight on me because everything's okay. So I got her this book, and she opened it, and she was at uni, and her flatmates looked at her and said, "My God, your mother's a bitch, isn't she?" And Tal told me this, and I went, "I'm not a bitch, but I know that you're not happy." And I just thought, if you could read something to help you, kind of transmute what's going on in your body so that your body's happy, and then it will start behaving as you want it to behave. And I believe that, don't you, Helen?
Yeah, and so much of our perception, because I still struggle with body dysmorphia, so I don't necessarily see my figure as other people see it, but so much of our perception is like is to do with all of these things, like loving what we enjoying moving, not going on a run and being like, I'm not running fast enough, I'm not burning enough calories, but like going on a run for the joy of seeing the sunshine and the being outside and the high you get from the endorphins and and then as much enjoyment eating your food. And it's when I've spent years punishing myself with food by either not eating or eating food that's terrible for me, and none of that was enjoyment. But when I can enjoy it, even if it's nutritionally weak and calorie dense, it's a very different relationship and a very different result on the scales. It's like when I travel and I'm in heat for me is also another medicine. When I'm in heat and I'm backpacking around Mexico or whatever I'm doing, I feel like, oh, I'm eating so much more and okay, and I'm moving, but I never put on weight when I'm away because I love the food I'm eating and I love the sunshine. My whole vibration is so much more expansive and softer than I find when I'm in the hustle and the bustle and the grind of the daily.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And, I think it's a very sad indictment of the time that we live in that we don't say grace anymore. So when I was at school, we always said grace. And it's a practice that I brought back into my house. And because my children think I'm a bit mad, I just rephrase it. So I just say, thank you, farmers. Thank you, Philly, if I've cooked it or whoever's cooked it. And so just giving that gratitude. And then I just go, oh, can we just smell the flavors? Can we just smell the flavors before we taste the smell? Because it's all connected. I know that sounds very funny, but I just try and connect all the senses together. And I think that's really, really important. And again, that comes back to the heart and to loving. Tell us a little bit about your work with the heart, because that is your forte.
Sure. And actually, what you were saying about the food, and it takes me into my relationship with cacao, because I always get, when I'm holding ceremonies, get people to do a big sniff before they taste it, because you're getting the molecules up into the brain first, and you're getting it into your body in those initial moments. So my work around the heart started very organically, stepping stones, similar to the story you've been sharing with me before we started recording, about just following the next right step and opportunities opening. And when I was several years sort of deep into my healing path, became very conscious of the amount of healing I'd had and felt so grateful I'd been able to come off all the pharmaceuticals I was told I'd need for life. I was, loving myself. My life was unfolding in a very different way. And I wanted to give back. I wanted to be able to share things back to people. So long story short, in the same way I dismissed mushrooms and thought, what are they going to do? I dismissed cacao because I had a big barrier where chocolate was concerned, and that was a bad food. And in my naivety and my ego, is like, what are mushrooms going to do? What's chocolate going to do? Like, not my bag. Like, I do the strong medicines. And then by accident, I had some ceremonial grey cacao at a retreat. And then the second time I had it, which was a byproduct of wanting to be at a sound journey, and the cacao was served, I got a very strong message I was meant to work and serve this medicine. And I trained for 2 years and still wasn't unsure. I had a lot of misgivings about being behind an altar or how I was going to make this medicine, like my relationship with the medicine. And then eventually I started doing it for friends. Then it grew and grew and grew. And very organically, I then booked a venue and I sent out a newsletter. And I had so much paranoia about writing this newsletter. And I'd create it to all the people I knew. I didn't have a proper list, but to lots of friends and friends of friends. And I'm dyslexic, so it had a million spelling mistakes in it, because I thought if I reread it, I will never send it. So I sent this thing out and it sold out. And then I did another one the next month and that sold out. And then the venues got bigger. And so with the cacao ceremonies, because I've coached people primarily in business, that was my sort of go-to between acting work, I brought the coaching in, and I brought my Buddhist teachings in, and I brought my understanding of shamanic work in, and treated it as a plant medicine, which it is, and poured my love into those spaces. And then they grew, and I was doing massive ones every month around Europe and around London on different themes. And then all sorts of things happened. I had a nudge that I was supposed to then take it to a trade fair called Discover Cacao, which I thought was a cacao experience. And so I ordered a huge amount of cacao, went to the trade fair. It was full of Cadburys.
Oh
And
my
it's the
God.
only, and it was like, and everyone's coming around my store going, boy, it doesn't have any sugar in it, and it was a
Okay,
real
I'm going to
nightmare.
stop you because I'm going to have to take you back, because there might be people listening to this episode that don't know what cacao is. And so I
Yes.
want to take you right back to the beginning of cacao. Now, when I first discovered it, somebody said, oh, we'll do a cacao ceremony tonight. And I really thought she was just making hot chocolate and this was a load of old bollocks. And I was just like, okay, take us back from right back to the cacao tree, what happens under the soil, just, how important is this as a plant medicine?
Sorry to interrupt this podcast. The Wellness Way has got a brand new interactive ebook out. I've created a beginner's guide to your natural health systems to help you navigate through the jungle of natural health. A banquet of knowledge wrapped up in a simple ebook, featuring some of my top guests from the podcast. As an added bonus, I've even thrown in my meditation album, The Wellness Awakening, From Past Lives to Passing. Head over to my webpage, phillyjlay.com, to grab your copy now. And while you're there, why don't you sign up for my newsletter? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this podcast so we can continue to get this information out. Remember, the doctor of your future is you.
So back to trees, right? So it's a tree, and whenever my faith is waning, I think, well, hang on a second. We live in a universe where strawberries exist and where cacao trees exist. And the reason I think we are meant to be eating the cacao is because if I've seen them in the wilds of the Amazon, like they are the same height as us, so they're eye level, and they have branches, these trees, and off the branches are huge pods that are like the size of your forearm, and they're orange and yellow and purple. Each one's a different color, and it's a chocolate tree. There's chocolate hanging off the tree in multicolored wrappers. Like the box of roses is a poor imitation to what nature, God, the universe, source has created for us to eat. And when we eat this in its purest form, where it's been fermented in and it's not had it's specifically any sugar, dairy, or been overheated, because that breaks down the neurotransmitters and the neuromodulators which allow the heart expansion, the body to be flooded with. So when you go on a run and your body releases serotonin and dopamine and these things, and you get the runner's high, that is what cacao is able to do. And unlike chocolate, when you reach for it and for a few minutes you feel good and then you feel because you have a crash with the sugar, cacao doesn't have any of the negatives, but it allows that experience of the heart opening and the high without feeling ungrounded, if you have too much, dosage dependent, to last in the body for between 4 hours and 72, depending on what else you're putting in your body. So it's a natural antidepressant. It helps restore muscles. It can help with neurodiversity, ADHD, Parkinson's, because it helps the brain, sends up to 40% more blood through your brain. So if you're stuck in a loop with a problem, it allows creativity to flow through you much stronger. And so, and it's the only naturally forming source of arginine, which our body really needs. I mean, there's so much in the science about it, but in terms of the spirituality, it is a heart medicine. It's very bitter, and in Chinese medicine will say like the bitters are the things that are for the heart. In the same way, like sugar actually is very sweet and is corrosive to the body, and so cacao is a naturally occurring, is what chocolate comes from, but it's not been processed. And depending on the age of the tree, the way it's grown, the soil it's grown in, depends on whether and how it's processed afterwards, depends if it's ceremonial grade or not. Because the cacao you get in a powdered form from your health food shop is not going to help you expand consciousness. But the ceremonial grade has that capacity, especially when it's done within a ceremonial context and with other people and the space is held. Yeah, there's and also because cacao grows around the equator, it's like the planet has a big chocolate belt on it. It has been worked with in many different ways in many different cultures, unlike other plant medicines which are specific to one area or one culture. So you can microdose with it, you can replace coffee with it, you can have it as a pick-me-up in stressful situations, or you can have a larger dose and drop in to birth your business or vision the home or whatever it might be.
Apparently, the Mayans, it was so incredibly precious to them that when they were invaded, I can't remember, was it the Spanish or the Portuguese that invaded them? I can't remember. But when they were invaded, they didn't panic at all these ships coming and wanting to take all their stuff. They were going, have our gold. It's fine. We don't need our gold. But you don't touch our cacao. They were just, they were kind of like, you can have everything. Don't kill us. You can have everything. Not the cacao. You don't touch the cacao, baby. And it was that precious to them. And it is, you sink into this wonderful, deep feeling, don't you? It's so relaxing. And so the first time it wasn't like that for me. I just, because I didn't allow myself to be open to it. I really thought this was silly and it was just a hot chocolate. And then when I did the ceremonies and your heart, as you said, just open. Tell us about, I read about your first experience with cacao and then you were cycling home afterwards. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, that was the second. That was when I got the message that I was meant to work with it, and I was like, really? But I'll talk about why I think that happened. But yeah, I'd cycled across London. I was at this sound healing ceremony where you also got cacao, and about 3 or 4 people hadn't turned up, and so my dear friend who was holding the space said, "Oh, Helen, you can have another cup of cacao if you want." And I was like, "All right, yeah, I quite like this." And the cacao had started working with me, and it was breaking down all my barriers about chocolate and calories and blah, blah, blah. And I ended up having like 3 cups of cacao, so I had a very strong dose.
It's a bit like the mushrooms at Glastonbury, isn't it? You just overdo everything, Helen.
I do have a tendency to jump in the deep end and ask questions later with pretty much everything. Yeah, a person of extremes. And so I was then, after it finished and amazing, and I had a huge journey with the sound healing, and then I had to cycle home, and I was cycling through Finsbury Park downhill, and it was like the trees were psychedelic and the light coming through the trees, and it was like all these light codes and messages, and I was like, oh my goodness. And it's like my other experience of plant medicines can be so grueling and deep and tough, and this was so gentle and loving and light, and those other plant medicines have that within them, but primarily I had a very kind of like up against the wall experience with most of them. But the cacao was this softness, and because of my tendency to be in a fight with life and a battle, and very much I didn't, my divine feminine didn't exist. Like I hadn't embraced it. I lived in black and boots and anger, and I wasn't in a feminine energy, and cacao allowed me to soften. It allowed me to, because a lot of extreme things had happened to my body as a child and as an adult, it allowed me to work with softness and gentleness. And because the hardness and the extremes were what I knew, it was a whole new spectrum of how to be in the world that cacao allowed me to soften into, to the extent that I don't really wear black anymore. And I'm not triggered by women wearing pink or bows or ribbons or the things that used to make me very angry. And because anything that was sensitive or soft, I saw as vulnerable. And if you're vulnerable, bad things are going to happen. So I became conscious of that, and I've been much more able to be more loving, to be more sensitive, soft. I was always sensitive, but yeah, to be much feel safer in that space. And cacao has definitely been a big conduit for that.
Can you tell us about the different countries? I know you actually sell on your webpage, and we'll come to that, 2 different types of cacao, but they all have different abilities on the healing front, don't they? They have different textures, different, tell us more about it. You're the expert, you tell us.
Okay. So they have different potencies, but in the same way, because it is a plant medicine, every time you drink or you have mushrooms or whatever plant you're working with, um, your in some dosage is important, but sometimes you can have a microdose and it feels like you've had a huge amount because it's what the consciousness of the plant feels that you need at that point. And that's why it's a co-creation and a co-relationship that you have with it. So sometimes people say, oh, I'm drinking it every day, is that okay? Or I'm not, or I don't want it anymore, I've had it for a long time. It's not a formula in the same way a friendship isn't a formula. Sometimes you see people a lot, sometimes you don't see them for a long time. It feels like you've never not seen them. Like the bond and the dance and the communion is a daily check-in about making sure you're not being unconscious with it. And that and the strength and how it affects you. Yes, there are different varieties. Yes, there are different strains, but it's a bit, to use probably quite a naff analogy, it's a bit like wine where you can have different grapes. So you might, and the grapes might be different from different countries. So you might have a Chardonnay or a Shiraz or a Pinot Grigio or whatever it might be. The effect is you're going to feel, maybe this one makes you feel tipsy sooner, or but that's also going to be to do to how much you've eaten and how emotionally stressed you are and who you're with. And it's similar with cacao in terms of the spirit of cacao exists within them all, and as your relationship with that spirit and as your body works with the medicine, and depending on how clean or how sort of toxic the build up in your body is, will depend on the effect you have. And so I can talk to you about favorite ones, and some are more bitter and some have slightly more feeling of caffeine in them. They have theobromine in, which is a relative of caffeine, and that is what allows the blood to move faster through your system, and that's where sometimes you can feel slightly more rushy. But you can also mitigate that by putting more fats into the cacao, like coconut oil or cashew nuts, and that allows it, a bit like a bullet coffee, to have a smoother experience, or you can put more chili in it and that activates it faster. So yes, there are different strains, and yes, they have different tastes, and that's personal preference. And yes, you can then season and sweeten and change the consistency of them.
You don't bring them to the boil, do you?
No, what I do is I boil the kettle, I weigh out with filtered water, and then I weigh out the amount of water that I need, whether it's for a ceremony or it's just for me. And then I put the boiling water into the pan, then I add the cacao, and then I simmer it. So I bring it just up to sort of, when it's just about to bubble and the bubbles are kind of just about to kind of come up, and then I turn it down and then I simmer it and I pray into it and I add my spices and whatever it might be, and I talk to it, and I thank God for making the spirit of cacao and bringing this beautiful medicine, and like how lucky I am to be in the UK and it's traveled across the seas. And if I'm holding space with a client one-to-one and we're having a ceremony, just the two of us, like I put all of what they're calling in into it. And I think that helps activate it. And like plants like to be talked to, like that relationship builds that relationship. And then I blend it, and some of them don't need to be blended, but it adds a lot of thickness and a lot of froth, and it stops it being watery, which some people complain it can be.
So tell us your 2 favorite ones then. I interrupted.
So my 2 favorite ones are the ones that I carry. One's from the Peruvian Andes, and that's very smooth. It's great for a sort of daily, one that you're having in your day, or if you've got a stressful Zoom meeting, or a landlord letter to write, whatever it might be. That's a great ally, and it's an easy way into working with plant medicines, especially if you're a little bit scared or unsure or want to check it out. And it's also, because it's smooth, you can chop it up and nibble it. If I'm ever wanting some of the health benefits without moving into the more fluid state that cacao brings your consciousness, I will munch that. Very good for you. The other cacao I carry is handpicked by the Quechua tribe in Ecuador, and that is less, it's not as smooth, it's knobbly, it's a bit like an aero bar. You can break it off. There's more in the bag because per weight it's a bigger density. And it grows, the trees are 50 years old, so they're much older than most cacao trees. And the roots grow through other plant medicines. So ayahuasca vines and things like that are growing on the same land. And that is a subtler but deeper medicine. So I feel that very much the day after I've drunk it. I wake up with a, sort of Julie Andrews, like Disney little birds flying around feeling. And I'm like, why do I feel so good today? And it's, I had cacao yesterday. And that definitely has a sort of deeper, longer effect in my system. And is a beautiful medicine.
And bottom line, it's a heart medicine, that wonderful organ of our body that is so extraordinarily intelligent, that tells us everything that's going to happen way before our brain. And, it is kind of ignored. And, we think about nourishing our brain on a regular basis. And, you might take your adaptogens like your lion's mane, but you have to nurture your heart too as well, don't you, Helen?
100%, because if this is your operating system, the choices you make are going to be so much more in alignment with your soul, your mission, your big purpose. And it's the head decisions, the kind of the logic and the rationale, which get us stressed and in lack and in fear. And the more I've learned to surrender in here, that's where I can take much more courageous steps, things that people go, that's so risky. And I'm like, my heart's telling me to. Like, yes, on paper it is, but I've got the feeling.
But hey, you're talking to a woman who took 2 bags of mushrooms on her first shot, so it ain't risky to me. Oh, I love your work. I find it so uplifting and so enlightening. Helen, as we come to the end of this episode, please tell our audience where they can find you and all the wonderful work you do, because you do ceremonies for people far and wide, from 1 to 121. So tell us all about them.
Great, thanks, Philly. So my website is hearthealer.co.uk. And on Instagram, I'm Helen Heart Healer, and Facebook, Helen the Heart Healer. And I've also got a Telegram channel, but my main places to get me are there. I work with groups and I have ceremonies. I also run workshops in the summer to help people connect with trees. I've got one coming up on Sunday on Hampstead Heath, and I sell cacao. My main work is working with clients one-to-one on deep transformation. And I also speak a lot to people about healing their relationship with money. And I've got some talks on YouTube about that. And my YouTube channel is Helen Millar. And if people are looking to start their own business or increase their side hustle, or potentially like just in the planning phases, or would like to leave corporate and move into something else, I have a course called The Prosperous Heart, and I'm gifting the first chamber of that. So they're each 4 chambers, the first chamber of that on my website. So if you go into the link, which I'm going to share with you, people can get access to that for free.
That's fantastic. And we'll put all of that in the show notes. What a wonderful episode. I do, as I said, feel very happy and very enlightened. And Helen, I do need you to come back at some point and talk about money and our relationship to money, because I love you talking about this. But for now, lovely people, I'm off for a cup of cacao. Helen, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Bless you.
Thanks, Billy. My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.